Hey Gordon, we're in a Mercedes C-Class today, and we've got some brake discs that we need to change. So the procedure we're going to show you today is how to repair or fix the brakes or change the pads in the rotors on a C-Class Mercedes. This happens to be a C230. It's a 1999. What happens when the pads finally wear out is that you get a little flickering as you apply the brake. You get a little flickering light up on the dash. Let's see if I can get it. See that flickering light right there, right to the right of the odometer. Let's do it again. I'll keep driving and applying the brake, and every time you apply the brake you see that little flickering. That means the pads are worn down, and actually probably the rotor is a little out of round, because every time it makes a revolution you're getting a little electrical connection, and so it's a little bit out of round. And you see that the slower I go, the less frequency on the flicker. And so if you were going really fast and you applied it, it almost becomes a solid light, because the rotor is turning so fast that it just integrates the light, and it becomes solid. But if you're going real slow, you can see that it flickers real slow, and it's an indication that every time the revolution on the rotor comes around. So what we need to do, we're pretty sure we'll have to look at them, is change the rotors and the pads, and that's fairly typical of a Mercedes. The rotors are throwaway rotors. You don't turn them. In other words, you don't put them on a lathe and actually smooth them out and make them real flat again, which is the process for the real old steel rotors like that on American cars. You typically make them flat by putting them on a lathe. We don't do that for most European cars. We just toss the rotors away and put a new set of rotors on there when we put pads on. It's always a good practice anyway, because if those rotors are just a little bit out of flat, it's going to wear those pads out in a very short period of time. So when you change the pads, you shouldn't scrimp and not change the rotors on these cars. It's best just to go ahead and change the rotors. They usually only cost $40 a piece or somewhere in that neighborhood if you buy them online. So anyway, that's going to be our process today. So we'll be back with you in the garage and show you how to change the pads and the rotors on a Mercedes C-Class. Now, the first thing we've got to do is jack the car up and get the front wheels off. We're just going to show you one side. Both sides are going to be done exactly alike, but we're going to try to show you where to place the jack right now. There's a cross member right behind the plastic piece that covers up the pan, and we want the jack to be right across that cross member so it can jack up the whole front end of the car. So let's get the camera out and show you exactly where we want the jack placed. We always use a little block of 2x4 with our jacks. Depends on the kind of jack you have. But if you take a look, Gordon will show you with a camera exactly where we want that block of wood, right under that cross member, and then we'll slowly jack it up, and we'll put some jack stands underneath the A-frame right inside each one of the wheels. As you can see, it goes up nice and easy. We've got the emergency brake on, and the car is in park. Sometimes those blocks of wood kind of snap and break depending upon the pressure points, but you can see it comes up nice and even if you get the jack in the middle. And I don't know if that's high enough for these jack stands or not. We'll know in just a second. Just a little more. I've got some pretty heavy jack stands that I'm using. Now you see, we want it right under these cross members right here. And I put it so that I kind of hook it back or front, but I want it in such a way that it catches on that cross member right where the center of the spring is. Just because it's so stable that way. So I'm going to let it down real slow, make sure it catches just right. I don't like that. I want it a little further back.
Now you see, it's dropped all the way down. No reason not to just keep my jack there, just for extra precaution. But you can see it's real stable. And the wheels are nice and high. So now we're going to pull the wheels off. But first, let's show you a picture of the pads and the rotors that we've got here. One of our very favorite online parts stores is Auto House right here in Arizona where we live, and they ship directly to our homes all the time, UPS or business. And you can see these are the pads and rotors. There's the invoice on it. So from Auto House, the rotors are about 50 bucks a piece. So go to your favorite online store and find them. These are ATEs, and those are the rotors. And I don't know if you can see the number, but you can certainly see it on the invoice. This is Auto House part number 210-421-0712. And these are the pads. So you get a set of pads. For the front, it would take 2 pads on each side. And then we just always keep a lot of extra sensors. These sensors are real common on Mercedes. They use them on a lot of different models. And that's the thing that's rubbing against a little, that's the electrical connection that wears down, or when the pads wear down, that's the electrical connection that gives you the lamp on the inside of the car on the dashboard that says you need to change your pads. And we'll show you how those little things that'll be real obvious fit into the pads. So those are the parts that we need. So we got to have some pads, and it really takes some sensors and some rotors. Now let's pull the wheels off, and we'll show you which tools we need to do this change out. You may not have an impact, and you may just have to use a lug wrench, but it's 5 lugs that you have to take off. And you might have to loosen them up before you jack the car up while the wheel is still on the ground, if you don't have an impact wrench, if you're just using a lug wrench. At any rate, you got to get the wheel off first. This particular model, we put what we call clean wheels on. You see it's a little thing that keeps the dust from the pads off of the outside of the wheel, and so the wheel, you know, these happen to be chrome wheels, and so they don't get so nasty with all that brake dust. So if you have those, just be careful that you make sure and get them back in the right spot. So we'll set that aside, and we'll look at what we've got here. And you can see the rotors here, and the pads are of course inside here, inside what we call the caliper. The very first thing we're going to have to do to change the pads is to pull the caliper off. We've got to pull the caliper off to get the rotor off anyway, so we might as well just go ahead and pull it, because we got to pull it to do both things. Now, if you look, there are 2 hex bolts that hold the caliper on, and what we're going to have to do is pull those hex bolts, and then we're going to use a coat hanger to hang this whole caliper assembly up somewhere to the, somewhere up here in the wheel well, so that we don't put any pressure on that brake line, because that brake line, we absolutely don't want to put any strain on it. Now these are 7mm hex, so if you see there's a little plug right here, and we want to pull that little plug off, see it, and underneath it is the 7mm that fits in there. And so all we need is just a regular, breaker bar or ratchet, and normal counterclockwise to pull that off. And so there's one on the bottom as well right there. And so you can see they're not that tight. 7mm is not that big of a bolt. And so what we want to do is pull those off, and then we can get the pads out of the caliper assembly, but we're going to have to leave them off in order to change the rotor. We'll show you. Anyway, I got to pull those 2 bolts. We'll come back when we get them off. Now, in order to get, you see this caliper assembly, it's an assembly that's attached to something that's of course to the steering mechanism on the car. But this piece is separate from this other piece. But one of the things we have to do is take this spring off. You can see it just pops right out of there, but it's one of the things that attaches the rotor to this bracket. Now the other thing we need to do is to disconnect this little sensor
Eventually, I don't think we need to do it right now, but nonetheless, I did disconnect it. You see where it just plugs in right there, because we're going to replace that. Now, other than the brake pads clamping down against the rotor, there's nothing else that's holding the caliper on there. It's just the brake pads are kind of tight. You may have to back off of them a little bit by getting a screwdriver and just prying the piston in, but you can see that it's sort of loose now. I don't know if I may have to, yeah, I may have to pry the piston in there a little bit, because it's still kind of tight. The pads are still kind of holding on there, and well, maybe it's going to come off for me. Yeah, I guess it is. Now you see, actually, these brake pads the hose, the brake hose is really tight, and it holds it on there pretty well. But as I said, as a safety precaution, normally what we do is just, because we're going to be working on this thing, is just take a piece of coat hanger and thread through there like that. Just make sure we don't put any tension, and then tie it up somewhere, like to a shock or something, so that we get the pressure off of the brake line, whatever I can tie it to, whatever is convenient in terms of just finding. That'll work. So I just threaded around the top right there. Now you see I've got the tension off of the brake line now, so it's supported there. Now you see the pads, the one pad is already stuck to the, it's just hanging there, okay? Stuck right there. Comes right off, see? And the other pad is here, and of course it just comes right off too, like that. That piece sticks inside the little piston that makes everything work, sticks inside the piston of the caliper. Now you've got to pull this 18 millimeter. I thought it was a 17, it's an 18. And I don't know whether I'm going to need a breaker bar or not. It looks like I'm going to be able to get it off without a breaker bar. So there are two 18 millimeter bolts that hold this bracket on. Be careful that breaks. Almost got it here. So those two 18 millimeters, and then this thing comes off, you see. If you're not going to pack the wheel bearings, which I don't necessarily recommend, but you don't have to pack the wheel bearings. You could just take the rotor off without taking that bolt off. So if you're not interested in taking the wheel bearing hub assembly apart, all you really have to do is take that 5 millimeter bolt off right there. And if you do, then the rotor will slip right off of the hub. It'll slip right off of that bearing assembly where it is, and so you don't have to take all that apart. So you can see that it just comes right off, and then that's the tapered bolt that holds it on there. So we'll just do it that way on this side to show you. Now we just line that back up with the hole, with the one with the threads, and it might be easier to use the wrench. As I said on the other side, it's a self-aligning mechanism, and it doesn't really have to be that tight, because what really holds it on there is the wheel. And of course the rest of the assembly is just like on the other side, so we won't film that again. Now, in order to get this rotor off of there, we've got to undo a big nut that's underneath this dust cap, and I always just take a chisel and a hammer, knock these dust caps off. So you got to kind of tap them, but you can see that underneath it, there's just a nut, and it's locked down with a little hex bolt. It's a 5mm, so you got to take it and undo the loosen it up anyway. As soon as you loosen it, you're going to find that this nut is just like finger tight. And the reason is you don't want to put a load on these bearings, so you don't tighten them down real tight. And when we reassemble, we'll show you how you tell where to stop in terms of tightening that nut. But you just turn this nut off, and there's bearings on both sides of this rotor, here and in the back side. So as soon as you take those bearings out, you see, and we'll repack them while we're at it. I always just throw it in there. For now, this just comes right off. You see the rotor comes right off. And so there's a bearing on the inside, you can see, as well as that bearing that we took off of the outside. Okay, so now we can get the rotor off. Now we've got to separate the rotor from the hub, and there's just a 5mm little bolt right there, and it's holding one to the other. It should be simple enough to get off of there, and then you can see that this hub where the bearings are, this separates from the rotor as soon as you take that off of there. And so we wanted that. This is the bad piece. That's what we want to change out. Now, I want to take that grease seal out, and sometimes you have to get a little leverage on that thing with a screwdriver. And if you don't have a vise, and mine's not handy right now, what I'm going to do is mount this thing backwards in the old rotor, so that normally the grease seal that I want to get to happens to be like this. Okay, so it's on the inside, and that creates too deep of a crevice to get a screwdriver in. So an easy way to do that is just to mount the hub temporarily backwards back on the old brake disc, and now I'm going to have something to get some leverage on, and I don't even have to mount it tight. I just have to secure it same way that I was doing with that tire, so that I have a reference point, if you will, something to secure it without putting it in a vise. So I don't have to have it tight or anything. I just need to get something I can grab onto. So what I need to do is get that grease seal out of there. And as I say, you frequently just destroy them in the process. There it's coming. There. Now the bearing is there. That's what I want to repack while we're at it. Okay, so I packed that one with that grease packer. We'll film how to use that. But I packed the bearing full of grease, and I usually just wipe some on the outside, and the race still has plenty. You know, there's what they call a race, what that bearing rides on right there, and that's all still got plenty of grease inside that hub. And so what you want to do is just set the bearing down in there, and then we're going to take our new grease seal right here, and it's real obvious the way it goes in. I think you see it's got a lip there that's different than that. The outside of it is the smooth part of it, and the inside of it has a lip on it. And we want to just put it in there, and then what we do is we just get a hammer and tap it in there. Let me go back into the shop and get my hammer. Usually what I do is just get a little block of wood so I don't hurt that seal. At least get it started. It mounts flush. Okay, so now we've got the inside bearing. Of course, that's the most difficult one. The outside bearing, as you recall, it's secured down with a nut, so it doesn't have any kind of a seal. So what we're ready to do now, and I need to clean my hands up so I don't get grease all over that new rotor, is to put that rotor on there. But first, let's show how to pack that bearing with this little bearing packer. Let me go get that other smaller bearing. So to pack the bearing, all we really do, it's very simple. We just put the bearing in there like that. And this is kind of a messy job, but it's just two concentric cones. They screw together. You got to get the bearing kind of straight in there. And then just attach a regular grease gun with that special wheel bearing grease, and then you'll be able to see the grease come out of the bearing. I'm pumping the grease in there, and look on the edges. It comes right out, and that's what we want. We want grease all inside the bearing. It doesn't do any good on the outside of the bearing. Now, I don't know if you can see that, Gordon, but
yes,
it's coming out.
Yes, I can.
Now, so as soon as we get it coming out on all sides, we've got our bearing packed, and then we can just take it out of there. Now that bearing is full of grease, and that's what's important. Okay, Gordon, now we've got the wheel bearings packed, and we've got we've got this thing cleaned up a little bit. What I use is just, they just make brake parts cleaner. This process involves, just greasy, and so what you do is you get grease all over that rotor, and you want to clean it off. I probably have to clean it again before I'm finished, but you got the back wheel bearing packed in, and what we do is just slide it on the hub, on the spindle, and we pack this front wheel bearing as well. So we put that wheel bearing in there like that, and then we take that nut, and we're going to put this nut on. You got to be careful and get it on the right way. It'll screw on there either way, but what you want is that real flat part on the outside, and you can see that the beveled part goes right against the edge of that bearing, and that goes in. So the kind of the rough edge goes in, and the real smooth flat edge goes on the outside. That's how this particular one is on there. So what we do is we tighten it up, and then we back off of it. Essentially, it ends up finger tight. Otherwise, it puts a load on that bearing. You got the bearings too tight up against there otherwise. So you see how tight that is? And usually the mechanic's rule of thumb is you tighten it, and then you back off the wrench until you feel it break free. Right there, okay? So right in there is where you want to be. Now, it can't be loose. It doesn't have any play, but at the same time, it's essentially finger tight, okay? And that's all you want, because if you tighten that too tight, you squish the bearings too tight against what's called the race, and it puts what's called a load on the bearings. You need the needles to be able to have just a little bit of free play, essentially. So we want it just about finger tight, and then we take our 5mm and we tighten down that nut. We tighten down, and that's what holds it in place so that it doesn't move, because it's really not tight, you see. But that's tight, and now it won't move. And now this ought to turn free real easy, okay? Now next we're going to put the bracket back on there, and then we're going to put the pads on. So you recall, the bracket goes on next. Now normally, if you look at these, they're put on there, you see that little bluish tinge? They're put on there with what's called Loctite, which is thread sealer. And that's pretty wise when you're dealing with brake parts, to put a little drop of Loctite on these bolts. I don't like to use that permanent Loctite. I use the medium strength stuff because I usually keep my cars enough times to do these brakes several times, you know, long enough to do the brakes several times. That red Loctite is really, really hard to get off. It's called blue, number 242, and it says removable. Sometimes it has medium on it. It's in a red container, but there's some that's the red variety. It's got red on it, and that's the one you can't get off. But you just put a drop of it on there on each one of these bolts. Just, that's all it takes. And we do that with both these, and we do that with those hexes as well. So as you recall, this goes on there like that, and we just put it back on the way it came off, of course, and it'll really only go on one way, so there's not a lot of risk that you'll get it on there wrong. Now we're ready to put the pads back. And I've got the caliper sitting up here, no pressure on that brake line. And what I have to do is mash that piston all the way back. And it goes back real slow because you're forcing fluid backwards through the system. But as much as I can, I don't like to break into the system so that so I don't have to bleed the brakes. I have a great big pair of pliers. You could use a C-clamp just as well, but the edge of the piston right there is steel. And what we want to do is just mash it backwards, and you can see it moving back and you can feel it moving back. All you're doing is pushing fluid backwards through the system back up into the master cylinder. And you got to push it all the way down because the new pads are going to be real thick compared to the ones that we took off. And so unless this is backed off all the way, we're never going to get those pads in there. And we'll feel it when it finally bottoms out. When that piston finally bottoms out, it stops. You can't mash it anymore, and that's it. Now, while we've got this thing up here, we're going to put a drop of Loctite on these threads as well. Just both the threads for these bolts. We're going to put a drop of Loctite on there so that we lock those up. Where's my little cap? What we're going to require is two pads, and you recall they come in a set has 4. We got to have one pad with that little gizmo, that little steel gizmo attached to it, and one without. As you recall, one of them goes inside that piston, the one with the steel, okay? Now, don't worry about this. We're going to put this on later. It goes right like that, but we don't really have to put it on there yet. So we won't worry about it. That's the little electrical sensor. But we're going to put the pad, okay, in such a way that it's like that, okay? And we just snap it inside that piston. Trying to get as little grease on it as possible. Sometimes they can be kind of a challenge to snap in there, but you can feel when they snap in there. And then the other one, of course, goes like that, such the arc is in the right spot, okay? And then once we get them where we want them, we'll take the wire off and just slide it right on there. Okay, and so when you get it proper, you can see that these little hooks will be exactly against that bracket right there and right there on this pad, okay, and everything will line up in such a way that you can start the bolts on the back side. Remember the 7mm bolts that hold the caliper on? Well, now they're all lined up, and I'm just going to take my wrench and tighten them up. So once we get those tight, the next step is to put the little sensor on there, put the little cups over the holes, and we're finished with, other than putting the wheel on. Okay, so you remember these two little cups, they go over the bolt holes like that. And now we've got the sensor to put on. It's real simple, as you recall. that little thing is going to go in that hole. So I was just able to push that one in there with my fingers. You can see that it just goes in there like that. Okay, and then once it's in there, you just push it into there. Okay, and that's it. It's all in there. Now we got to get us that. Remember that spring? That's the last thing. Now you got the spring back on, but we want to show you a close-up of what it looks like just to make sure you get it on there, right? So you see the little ends of the spring go in those holes, and then the loop comes behind this piece that's a separate piece from the caliper. So it essentially it holds the caliper, this side of the caliper, down a bit. Okay, so we got that on there, and now we didn't show, we need to put that grease cap back on there. I just tap them on there with a hammer, that dust seal on where the bearing is. And now we're ready to put the wheel back on. We're finished. Okay, so the last step is just to put the wheel back on, and that's a pretty simple task. You just have to line up the ball joints. Once you get one started, it's a lot easier to get the rest of them.